Every day, your team works hard, and every day, hours disappear into a process that nobody has ever fully mapped. You've tried fixing it, but the problem is still there. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what's hiding in that process, why every fix that you've tried before was likely aimed at the wrong thing, and the tool that changes everything. So let's dive right in. Let me tell you about a company that I worked with a few years back. It was a mid-sized professional services firm, around 80 employees. They had a client onboarding process that took 22 business days from signed contract until the first deliverable. 22 days. To put that in perspective, their closest competitor was averaging 12. They knew it was a problem. Of course they did. They'd been trying to fix it for 18 months. The first fix was headcount. They hired two additional coordinators to handle the intake workload, and processing time dropped from 22 days to 19. And then it crept back to 21 and then settled back at 22 again. The second fix was technology, a full project management platform rollout, customized workflows, onboarding checklists, automated task assignments, the works, with 3 months of implementation and 2 rounds of team training afterward. Processing time dropped to 18 days, and then it crept back to 21, and then it settled at 22 again. By the time I sat down with them, they weren't just frustrated with the problem, they were frustrated with their own inability to fix it. There were two serious attempts, both with real investment and measurable improvement, that just vanished into thin air both times. At the start of the initial conversation, I asked them one question before we did anything else. Can you walk me through the full onboarding process? Every single step, from the moment that a client signs a contract until the moment that they receive their first deliverable. There was a pause. The operations director looked at the COO, and then the COO looked back at the operations director. And after a few minutes of awkward silence, the ops director said, well, we have a process document and it covers about 4 steps. 4 steps for a 22-day process. You know that little voice that's in the back of your head that sometimes says, important things like, hey, be serious. Don't laugh here. Well, my little voice failed me that day. What they had was a summary, a simplified, idealized 4-step version of how they wished that the process worked. What they did not have was a map of how the process actually worked. The real sequence of steps, the real handoffs, the real wait times, the workarounds that nobody had documented because they just become part of how things worked. The project management tool wasn't wrong. The extra coordinators weren't wrong. They were both good ideas in a vacuum. Both were solutions that were applied without a diagnosis. They were answers to a question that nobody had fully asked yet. So that's what we built next, the map. And what we found on that map is what I want to walk you through today. Whatever process that's in your organization that feels slower or harder or clunkier than it should, there's a version of this story that lives inside of that process. Before we go any further, let me give you the tool, because once you understand how it works, everything else into this episode will click right into place. Value stream mapping is a lean management technique that creates a complete visual picture of every step involved in delivering a product or service to a customer. It captures the flow of materials and information from the moment that a customer makes a request to the moment that that request is fulfilled. Every step, every handoff, every wait time, every place where information enters or exits the process. Toyota developed this as part of their production system in the mid 20th century. The original Japanese term was material and information flow mapping, which is a mouthful to say, but it's accurate. VSM shows you both what is physically moving through your process and what information is driving that movement or failing to. For decades, VSM lived almost exclusively in manufacturing environments. Then operations leaders across industries noticed something that they had been missing, that the underlying logic translates into any process. Healthcare systems use VSM to cut patient wait times and reduce medication errors. Software teams use it to find delays in their release cycles. Law firms use it to help map where contracts disappear into approval queues for weeks on end. The core structure of VSM is three things. First is the current state map, which is a visual representation of the process as it actually exists today, not the ideal, not the documented version, the actual. The second is waste identification. Within the current state map, you identify every single point where time, resources, or effort are being consumed without adding any value to the customer. And third is the future state map, which is a redesigned version of the process with the major wastes removed. It's not a perfect version, but it's realistically better. Before we go any further, I need to be really clear and direct about the definition of adding value. This is the piece where most people just gloss over and it costs them in the long run. Value is not what you think adds value. Value is defined as what a customer is willing to pay for. If a customer will not pay more for your product or service because of X, Y, or Z, then X, Y, or Z have no value, period. Hold on to that thought, and it will change how you look at every step of your process. After the future state map, you implement, you measure, you review, and you improve again. That's the loop. And here's the best part. It doesn't require a certification, a consultant, or a week-long workshop to begin. All that's required is honesty, a stopwatch, and a willingness to go look at what is actually happening rather than what you think is happening. And that's harder than it sounds. So let's talk about how to build the map. Let's start with the most common mistake because it's going to save you from wasting almost the entire exercise. Most organizations build their current state map in a conference room. They gather 3 or 4 leaders together and pull up a whiteboard, and then they'll sketch out the process as they understand it. Everybody will eventually agree on a version, and they'll call it the current state map. But what they've actually produced is something called a consensus hallucination. And what that is a version of the process that's assembled from 3 or 4 different vantage points and filtered through 3 or 4 different biases and missing every single thing that nobody in that room has personally done in the past 2 years. The people in that conference room know the process from above. They know what it is supposed to be like. They don't know the Tuesday afternoon version where the system is slow and 2 people have called out sick. And there's a workaround in step 6 that nobody put on any of the training materials. And they certainly don't know that you have to whack the output tray on the blue finishing machine every couple batches with a hammer or it jams, but only if it's raining or humid that day. Real, honest current state mapping starts at the Gemba. And Gemba is a Japanese term from lean management. It translates literally as the actual place, the place where the work happens. You go there, you watch, you ask, you measure. You do not delegate this and then review someone else's notes. You go yourself. Here's how the mapping process actually works. You start at the end. Begin by identifying your customer and your customer's demands. What are they asking for? In what volume? And how often? Answers to those 3 questions establishes your takt time, TAKT. And that's the rate at which your process must produce output to meet the customer demand without over or without under producing. Think of takt time as the heartbeat of your process. If the heartbeat is off, everything downstream pays for it. Then you walk backward through the process from the finished product or service all the way back to the trigger that started everything. At each step, you collect four pieces of information. You collect processing time, which is how long does this step actually take from start to finish? You collect wait time. How long does this work sit waiting around before the step begins? You collect the number of people that are involved and the error or defect rate, which is how often does work need to be redone or corrected at that stage in the process. You also need to map the information flow. What triggers each step? Who sends instructions to whom? Where does information move electronically, on paper, or verbally? Information flow failures are one of the most common sources of process waste, and they're nearly invisible until you put them on the map. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. At Toby's Taco Truck, we walked through this exact process during a standard lunch service. The order comes in, that's the trigger. From there, we documented every single step. There's order capture, there's a queue, there's ingredient retrieval, and then there's assembly, and then there's a quality check, and then there's payment processing, and finally, the handoff to the customer. 7 steps in a process that the head chef had been describing as 4 steps for the past 3 years. Here's what the data actually showed. Total processing time across all 7 steps was 5 minutes and 20 seconds on average. That's the time when actual work was being done. The total time on average from order placed to order in customers' hands was 14 minutes and 4 seconds. And that math translates to a value added ratio of 38%. The inverse of that is 62%. 62% of the time that a customer spent waiting for their taco was pure waste. Nothing was transformative. Nothing that a customer would pay for. Work just sitting in a queue, extra steps back and forth across the truck, restocking interruptions, and a payment system in the wrong location. Do the math on a busy Saturday, 120 orders between 11 and 2. If 62% of each order time is wasted, you're looking at roughly 5.5 hours of cumulative customer wait that added zero value to anyone's lunch. That doesn't even include the lost sales from customers who walked away from the truck because the line was too long. And the people working in the truck were doing everything right. They were fast, they were organized, and they genuinely cared about the customers. The problem wasn't the people. The problem was the process that the people were faithfully executing. That distinction matters enormously. When leaders skip the mapping step and jump right into problem solving, they almost always blame the wrong thing. Sometimes it is the people, and sometimes they buy a technology solution, which just is a faster way to execute the same broken process. Nothing more. VSM shifts this entire conversation from who is causing this to what in the system is causing this. That single shift changes everything about what solutions get considered. Let's jump back to the professional services firm. When we walked through their actual onboarding process at the Gemba, observing and timing every step, we found 28 steps. 28 steps in a process that their leadership team had mapped as 4. The 22-day timeline started making complete sense now. Step 4 required a senior partner signature, and that partner averaged a 9-day turnaround time on signature request because nobody ever told them that the firm was losing 10 days of its competitive edge to that single approval. Step 11 required information from the client that nobody had collected during the intake meeting. Somebody had to go back and ask and then wait for a response and retrieve it in a format that didn't match the system and required manual reformatting, and then re-enter it into the system before the process could even continue. Step 19 was a quality check that was added in the process 2 years earlier after one error, and that quality check was run on every single file since, even though the error that it was designed to catch had a 1 in 800 occurrence rate. None of these steps was visible from a conference room. All of them showed up the moment that somebody went to the Gemba and started watching. Building the map is step one. Step two is knowing what you're looking for. And you're looking for exactly 8 things. As you build your current state map, you're looking for waste. Lean management classifies waste into 8 distinct categories. And knowing these before you start the mapping means that you'll recognize things that you might otherwise walk past. The first waste is defects. These are errors that require rework, correction, or replacement. Defects consume time twice. Once when the work is done incorrectly the first time, and then again after somebody finds them and fixes them. In most processes, there's also a third hidden cost, which is the downstream impact on whatever step was waiting for that corrected output. At the professional services firm, one intake form included a field that clients frequently misunderstood. Roughly 30% of submitted forms required a follow-up clarification from a staff member. The fix in this case was 5 minutes of conversation, but those 5 minutes were happening at day 4 of a 22-day process. And then the responses sat in a shared inbox that nobody checked before noon. A 30% defect rate in one field was contributing 2.5 days of delay to 1 in 3 client files. The second waste is overproduction, making more than the customer currently needs. In food service, it's prepping 100 units when you know that you're only going to sell 60. In professional work, it's the weekly summary report that takes someone 2 hours to complete and exactly nobody opens it. In project management, it's a 47-slide status deck for a client who only asked if the project was on track. Overproduction feels like thoroughness. It feels like going above and beyond, but it's still waste. The third waste is waiting, which is the most visible waste in most organizations. A step is ready to move forward, but it can't because something upstream is incomplete. An approval sits in an inbox. A decision is pending somewhere. A file hasn't arrived. Waiting is patient. It will sit there in your process indefinitely if you allow it. And here's what makes waiting particularly expensive. It doesn't only cost time, it costs context. A team member who has to put a file down for 3 days while waiting for an approval or a missing piece has to refamiliarize themselves with it before they can continue when that missing approval or piece has arrived. That refamiliarization doesn't show up anywhere on any report ever. It's invisible overhead that's just baked into your timeline. The fourth waste is non-utilized talent. People that are doing work beneath their capability. Experienced analysts that are doing data entry. Senior managers that are facilitating routine status meetings. People spend on average 30% of their day on administrative tasks. And the organization has never bothered to automate those or delegate because it's just always been done that way. This particular waste costs the organization the full value of what those people could produce at their capability level if they were allowed to work there. And it costs the individuals their engagement. People just know when they're consistently doing work that's beneath their ability or skill level. And that awareness eventually becomes frustration, and frustration becomes turnover. The fifth waste is transportation, which is the unnecessary movement of things. Physical materials, digital files, approval forms, information packets. Every unnecessary handoff is an opportunity for delay and an opportunity for error. The more times that something changes hands, the more places the process has to fail. At the professional services firm, onboarding documents were emailed out to 3 people, each of whom printed and reviewed and signed off, and then filed them in 3 separate locations. The review itself added value. The triplication did not. And 2 of those 3 review steps were leftover artifacts from a compliance process that was updated 3 years earlier, but nobody ever removed them from the workflow. The sixth waste is inventory. Work accumulates in between steps. In manufacturing, the physical product sits in storage or in a warehouse somewhere, awaiting advancement to the next step. In knowledge work, it's the stack of emails waiting to be answered or contracts waiting to be reviewed and requests sitting in a shared queue with no clear owner. Inventory is not neutral. Work that sits degrades, context dissolves. By the time that someone picks it up again, they often have to reestablish the state of the work before they can move it forward. The seventh waste is motion, which is the unnecessary physical or digital movement by the people doing the work. At Toby's Taco Truck, this was the multiple trips between coolers. In an office, it's clicking through 7 screens to find one file. It's walking to the other end of the building for the only functioning printer. It's the 30-second task that takes 4 minutes because the interface wasn't designed for the way the work actually flows. Motion waste normalizes fast. People adapt. They build muscle memory for the extra clicks or the extra steps. They forget that they're doing something inefficient because it has just become automatic. The map catches it because the map doesn't adapt. And the eighth waste is extra processing, doing more work than the customer needs or the customer asked for, reformatting a deliverable into multiple layouts when only one was requested, running 5 sequential reviews on one document that only warrants 2, or producing an analysis that is 3 times more detailed than the decision that it's meant to inform. The instinct behind extra processing is usually quality, care, or thoroughness, but the execution still produces waste. Here's how to use these 8 categories in practice as you build your current state map. You tag each step with the waste types that you identify. Some steps may carry only one, some will carry none, and others will carry several. The steps that have multiple waste types are your highest priority targets during implementation. And they're almost always the ones that have gone unexamined the longest. At the professional services firm, step 4, that senior partner signature, carried 5 waste types simultaneously. It had waiting waste. The file sat in the partner's queue for days. It had transportation waste. That request was routed through an assistant that was unnecessary in the first place. It had motion waste, which was the retrieving and the returning of signature requests that required the partner to interrupt a different workflow every single time. It had the waste of non-utilized talent. That partner's actual review of most of those files took less than 90 seconds. Their expertise wasn't what was really needed. And extra processing waste. Not every file requiring their signature actually required their judgment. A percentage of those files could have been handled downstream with a standard approval process. 5 waste types in 1 step. When we showed the partner that analysis, the conversation changed immediately and completely. They weren't being blamed for anything. They were being shown data that they never had access to in the past. Their response was immediate, which was, when can we change that process? Now that you know what's in the current state, the next question is, what do you build instead? Once you have a complete and current state map with all of the waste identified and tagged, you design the future state map. But before we get into that, I do want to address the most common mistake that people will make at this stage. The future state map is not a wish list. Nearly every time that I facilitate a future state mapping session, somebody in the room starts designing the perfect process, the one where every approval is instant because they've implemented some kind of AI-driven shiny object automation. It's the one where every handoff is seamless because we hired a dedicated workflow coordinator to coordinate the process. It's the one where there's no waiting because we've restructured the entire department. Those might be good ideas. They might even be great ideas, but they're not future state map material. The future state map is a realistic target for improvement. You're designing a meaningfully better process than the current state within the resources, technology, and organizational structure that you already have, not the ones that you wish you had. Perfect is the enemy of better. And in process improvement, better implemented beats perfectly planned every single time. Good future state design is built around four questions. Question number one, what does the customer actually want and at what pace? As we established already, this is your tact time. And that conversion shapes every decision that follows. Your future state needs to meet the real customer demand, not exceed it. Building a process that produces twice the amount of what a customer needs or asks for doesn't create value. It creates overproduction. Second is, where is the constraint? In every process, one step is going to be slower than all the others. That bottleneck determines the maximum throughput of the entire process. Regardless of how fast the other steps run, everything is beholden to that bottleneck. If you speed up 5 steps upstream from the constraint, all you've done is pile work in front of it faster. Nothing gets through the process any quicker. Address the constraint first. Everything else is secondary. Third is, how do you create flow? And flow is the condition where work moves through a process without any unnecessary interruption, queuing, or idle time. Creating flow typically involves reducing batch sizes of jobs or co-locating steps that hand off to one another and building systems that pull work forward when the next step is ready rather than pushing work forward on a fixed schedule. And fourth is, where do simple controls prevent errors? Lean calls these poka-yoke mechanisms. And those are typically low cost, high impact designs that make it difficult or impossible to execute a step incorrectly. A standardized intake form that eliminates the ambiguous field that required the rework of roughly 30%. A checklist at the handoff between steps 3 and step 4. A template that auto-populates information that's already collected rather than asking somebody to re-enter it. At Toby's Taco Truck, the future state map was built around 4 changes. Number 1 was to consolidate all ingredients into a single cooler arranged in the exact sequence that they're used during assembly, which eliminated every cross-truck trip. Number 2 was to create a restocking schedule that was tied to order count rather than the time on the clock, which was triggered at a specific threshold during a natural lull in the order flow. We relocated the payment system to the pickup window. 1 transaction, 1 location, no routing. And we capped the active prep queue at 2 orders. Anything more than 2, and the preparer starts managing mental overhead instead of managing tacos. Implementation of these took 1 afternoon. 0 capital expenditure. No new hires and no new software subscription. The average order time went from 14 minutes and 4 seconds to 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Output during a standard service shift was up 40%. 40% more output from an afternoon of reorganization. Not because the people got faster, but because the system got smarter. At the professional services firm, the future state map had 12 changes across its 28-step process. Not all of those changes were implemented at once. The first 3 were low effort and high impact. There was a redesign of the intake form that eliminated the ambiguous field. The partner signature step got moved from day 4 to day 1 with a standing block of time on the partner's calendar to review pending requests. And they removed the 2 redundant review steps from step 11. Those 3 changes alone reduced the average timeline from 22 days to 14, all within the constraints they already had and in under a month. Building a beautiful future state map and not implementing it is nothing more than an expensive wall decoration. The value of VSM lives entirely in what happens next. And what happens next needs a plan. Here's what that plan might look like in practice. When the professional services firm moved into implementation, the first question on the table was, where do we start? They had 12 changes identified and they needed a sequence. And the sequence that they chose is the same one that I would give any organization doing this for the very first time. Implementation planning is relatively simple in structure. For each improvement on the future state map, you define four things: what is changing, who owns it, what the success metric is, and when does it need to be in place. That's the whole plan. It's one page if you do it right. The sequencing is where the craft lives. Lead with the quick wins. Every process improvement effort has a honeymoon period. People are engaged, leadership is watching, and energy is high. Use that energy by starting with the changes that are easy to implement and that will yield results quickly. Get something on the board within the first couple of weeks. Momentum is a resource, and quick wins generate momentum. The professional services firm's first quick win was the intake form. The redesign of that took a couple of days, but it cut the 30% clarification rate down to 4. Within a week, the downstream bottleneck on day 4 had already begun to clear because cleaner files were arriving in the system. The team saw the improvement before anyone asked them to believe in the process. You complete one major change at a time. The temptation after a mapping session is to implement everything at once, and that almost always fails. Not because individual changes are wrong, but because simultaneous changes create organizational confusion and they make it impossible to isolate the impact of any one single change. They'll often overwhelm the people that are expected to execute them while still doing their regular jobs. Sequential implementation with a measurement period after each change produces cleaner results and it produces cleaner learning from the process. With any change, you measure before, during, and after. You've built data into your current state map. Use that as your baseline. Before any change goes live, record the metric, whatever it is. And then after implementation, measure again. That's how you prove that the work itself was worth doing in the first place. It's also how you catch cases where an improvement created an unintended downstream consequence. And those unintended consequences happen more often than most VSM guides would like to acknowledge. Measurement catches those early while they're still fixable rather than after they get entrenched into the new future state. Another key part of this is to involve the people doing the work in every stage of the process, not as recipients of your decision, but as participants in the mapping, the analysis, the future state design, and the implementation. They know things that aren't in any process document. They know the workarounds. They know why step 7 actually takes longer than is in the manual. They know which approvals are rubber stamps and which require genuine judgment. Their input during the mapping phase is irreplaceable. Their buy-in during the implementation determines whether the implementation holds. Organizations that do VSM with their frontline teams get better maps, better future states, and better implementation results than organizations doing VSM to their frontline teams every single time. Change that is done to people fails. Change that is done with people holds. I want to address something else that most VSM discussions tend to skip over. It's the difference between organizations that sustain improvement and those that slide back. VSM isn't a project, it's a practice. The most expensive mistake that organizations make is treating VSM as a one-time event. They map, they improve, they declare success, and then they move on. 6 months later, all the old waste has returned to the process, and new waste has crept in places that nobody was watching. The process had drifted backward because nobody was maintaining it. This happens because processes are not static. Teams grow, people leave and are replaced by new people with new and different habits. Workarounds appear and then become standard practice. Technology gets updated in ways that changes how steps are executed. Customer expectations shift. A process that was lean and efficient a year ago might be carrying significant waste today through no fault of anyone. The organizations that extract the most value from VSM build it into their operating rhythm. They run a current state review quarterly, not a full mapping project every quarter, a quick but structured review of the key process metrics, which can be done by asking a couple quick questions. Has the process changed in any material way? Where is new waste appearing, if any? And are we still hitting the targets that the future state was designed to achieve? If those answers are clean, the review takes an hour and then you move on. If something has drifted, then you know what needs attention before it compounds and gets worse. At the professional services firm, quarterly VSM reviews became part of their operations workflow. Within 18 months of their first mapping session, their average onboarding timeline went from 22 days to 8. That wasn't from one heroic improvement, but from a series of informed, sequential improvements, each one building on the data and learning from the last. The 2 coordinators that were hired in round 1 became significantly more effective once the process that they were coordinating was actually efficient. The project management platform performed exactly as designed once the process that was feeding it was cleaned up. The tools were always fine. The process that they were serving was the problem. VSM showed them that process. Everything else followed. I want to close this out today with the real reason that VSM works. Not the methodology, not the framework, the actual reason. It creates a shared understanding of reality. Before the map, every person on your team carries their own mental model of how the process works. And that's built from their experience, their role, and their vantage point, and the slice of the process that they personally touch. No 2 mental models are the same. Some are accurate within their lane, and almost none are accurate across the full process. This is why process improvement conversations so often become arguments. You're not disagreeing about solutions. You're disagreeing about what the problem actually is. And you're doing it without realizing that's what's happening. After the map, there is one picture, one shared fact base built from real data collected at the actual place where the work happens. Conversations stop being about perception and start being about evidence. I think the problem is in step 7 becomes the data shows that step 7 has a 6-hour average wait time and a 32% rework rate. That's a different conversation. That conversation produces solutions. The professional services firm's senior partner didn't know that their approval step was responsible for 9 of the 22 days. And that's not negligence. That's the natural result of a system that was never mapped clearly enough for that information to bubble up to the top. The moment that it surfaced, the partner was the one driving the solution. The map gives everyone the same information. And when everyone works from the same information, alignment stops being something that you have to manufacture and starts happening naturally. Here's what I'm asking you to do this week. Not a full VSM project, not a mapping workshop with your whole team, one process. Pick the one process in your organization that feels slower, harder, or more chaotic than it should be. Walk it, time it, talk to the people that are executing it and ask them, hey, what slows you down? And start drawing the map. What you find will surprise you. Not because something is wrong, but because something has been invisible. And visible problems are the only kind with a solution. I'm Toby Hoy, and you've been listening or watching to Toby Talks. You can find more episodes, more content, and more resources at toby-talks.com. And if this is the kind of content that helps you lead and operate better, subscribe so that you don't miss what comes next.